Can I now please officially welcome our main guest speaker for the evening, Dr. Dean Laplonge, who is a leading researcher in the field of gender, safety and communications. He's an adjunct senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales, and he's a wealth of experience in addressing gender and communication issues in the workplace for many organisations such as BHP Billiton, Rio Tinto, Nickel West, the Department of Mines and Petroleum in Western Australia. Dean's already run us through his very, very interesting presentation. He will take this evening about what he describes as the widely ignored link between gender and safety, showing how cultural expectations of gender often encourage people to take risks. At the same time, he'll try and provide some tools on how to deal with this. So please, Dean, I welcome you to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thanks all, and thanks for this wonderful opportunity to speak to you today. I've only been in Christchurch one night, and I spent the day talking to a lot of people this morning, trying to get a bit of an understanding of the context here. I'm going to go through some of the research and work that we've been doing, and then towards the end of the presentation give some, or throw out some ideas about how this is relevant to the construction industry and then to Christchurch. A lot of the ideas that I talk about, obviously this is my field of work. I'm very comfortable in the field of work, and I've been doing this field of work, particularly in heavy industries, for about 6 or 7 years now. There will be some time afterwards for questions, so if there's anything that you want to challenge or get more information on, please use that time. Otherwise, afterwards I'll be around as well. You can ask away. The first thing that I want to flag, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more deeply, but the first thing I want to flag is, and somebody mentioned this just before I came in, is talking about gender. When I talk about gender, I'm not talking about women in a particular industry. I'm going to expand on that knowledge, and expanding on that understanding of gender is important if we're to have a debate around gender and safety. Hopefully that'll become a little bit clearer as I give the presentation. Most of my work to date, or initially in the first sort of 4 or 5 years, was in the mining industry. We've recently been applying it in other industries such as oil and gas, construction, and a little bit now in Canada in the forestry industry. And we're seeing similarities. So when I talk about mining, that's because where most of the work has gone on. But please extrapolate from that and think about what I'm saying in the context of your own workplace and industry. One of the things that I noticed very early on when I started doing consulting work in the mining industry was that there was no relationship established between those who were dealing with gender issues, and it was very small at the time, and those that were dealing with safety issues. There was no conversation going on about the link between those two. And it's a very important link, and I'm going to go through some of what that link means. But when I started doing this research, there's no research that looks at the link between gender and safety in mining, but it's there in other fields. There's a clear link between gender and safety. And one of the things that I found astounding is that, and still to date, so if you are the person who's not this person, please come and talk to me so I can change my narrative. But still to date, I have not met one safety professional working in heavy industries that their training has involved thinking about issues of gender. And I find this really shocking because the relationship is so strong in terms of how understandings of gender affect our risk behavior or our approach to safety, that I find it astounding. And we did an analysis of training programs in Australia to see if we could find anywhere that gender is taught or discussed, and we couldn't find it. So one of the things that we initially concluded was that the mining industry, and now we're seeing the same, as I said, in oil and gas and in construction, that they're missing out on a huge opportunity to explore safety and explore our attitudes and our responses to safety through the lens of gender. when I talk about gender, and most of my work is in male-dominated industries or masculinized industries, those heavy industries. When I talk about gender, as I said, it's not about women. It's not about numbers of women. That goes on, that's a discussion that's usually taking place in human resources around recruitment and opportunities. Now, I see that as I understand it as an important issue and an important debate, but I do not understand why we're still having that same debate or still understanding gender that same way today. That issue around women in the workforce and whether women should have opportunities, equal opportunities in the workforce, equal pay in the workforce, equal access to employment, is a debate that was raised around the 60s and 70s. We've been having that debate for almost 50 years. It is absolute common sense. It is a no-brainer, as far as I'm concerned, politically, that women should have absolute equal opportunities in the workforce, that the sex of the person shouldn't matter. But that debate, where we're looking at numbers of women versus numbers of men, as if that is the gender debate, it isn't working in male-dominated industries, particularly in mining. We've just had a report come out in Canada that shows that in mining, the number of women in the mining industry is decreasing. We've analysed the reports on women in mining over the last 25 years, and it's showing the same methodologies, the same approaches, the same results and the same recommendations for 25 years. And the statistics have gone up and down a little bit, 1 or 2%. But there's been no massive change in the gender culture of mining. So we've had decades of reporting, and somebody came to me the other day and said they're about to do another report with a similar approach and similar kind of methodologies, using more money to investigate something that I know already they're going to find out, which is there is a lot less women in mining than there is men. So we've had very small changes in numbers of women, but we've also had very little impact on the gender culture of those industries, because the industries and the companies within those industries are looking at gender purely as a matter of physical men versus physical women. So we have diversity officers also working in very repetitive and fixed ways. And one of my criticisms, certainly this is outlined in my recent book about gender and mining, is that diversity officers don't think outside of that box. Either they're not trained to, or the institution, the organisation doesn't allow them to, or they don't want to. But they're constantly thinking of diversity, of gender diversity, as an issue of man versus woman. How can we be talking about gender in male-dominated industries that are also historically masculinized industries and not be having any debate about what it means to be a man or what it means to be masculine within those industries? How can we be talking about gender and not looking at the history of how those industries have been gendered? How can we be talking about gender in those industries without talking about masculine practices and what they mean and where they come from and how they impact the workplace? We've had no investigations into the gendering of industries. So the mining industry, as an example, the oil and gas industry is another example. We've seen as the industry has developed as a unique and definitive formalized industry over the last couple of centuries, nobody has looked at the relationship between understandings of gender in our culture and the development of those industries, and how that impacts on workplace practices and workplace cultures. So what that debate has done has said somebody, or maybe a couple of people if it's a big organisation, in human resources, you are the gender people or you are the diversity people, and you go and look after the gender issue, which actually means you go and look after women. So gender has been placed in a little ghetto, and it has been contained as an issue for and about women. Women have become the problem of gender, and they're seen to be the solution of gender. In, as I say, highly masculinized industries where the majority of employees are men. One of the ways that I look at gender when I'm doing my work in organizations and getting them to expand their understanding of gender or shift it is to look at gender as organizational. So gender doesn't come from within. You don't put me in a particular organization and I will act exactly the same way as I do when I'm at home or when I'm in a different organization. You don't put me in a particular culture and expect me that I will hold on to my gender exactly the same way as I would have in another cultural context. Gender is about doing. It's about practices. It's about how we understand what it means to be a man or a woman in a particular context. So you can look at this historically. We can look back across history and find different ways of understanding what it means to be a man 200 years ago than we do today. That therefore affects the way that we act out as men. You can look at this cross-culturally. A couple of years ago, I relocated my home to Canada, but still work a lot in Australia. And I recognize every time I fly backwards and forwards on a cultural level the different understandings of what it means to be a man in the Canadian context to what it means to be a man in the Australian context today. So I try to get people to think of gender as practices, doing, habits, behaviors, ways that we try to act out in society in order to be seen as a man or as a woman. It's also relational, because I can only understand what it means to be a man in my cultural space when I understand what it means not to be a man. And therefore I need the not men, which in our culture is the women. I need to understand them very deeply to understand what it is that I'm supposed to do to be seen as a man. How does this affect safety? When we have a debate about gender that says gender is just about bodies, it's about numbers of men versus number of women, one of the things that often gets thrown out is, well, if we have more women involved or more women in the organisation, that will make it a safer place, won't it? And that's a question I'm asking, because I know I'm going to get that question. I always get that question when I give my presentations. People will say, yeah, we just need more women. And I've had examples of working with senior managers who have tried that approach. That makes sense if we're thinking of gender as men versus women, and all women are the same and all men are the same, and they're complete opposites. So one comes from Venus and one comes from Mars. Then it makes sense. But that is not how we live gender. All women are not the same, and all men are not the same. We have a whole range of ways of behaving as men or as women. When we think about that, we might say, and some of the research does says, that men take more risks than women in our lives, but not because men are naturally trained, more animalistic or more crazy, more risk-taking naturally, but because culturally there are certain behaviours that are seen to be more acceptable for men than acceptable for women. Or there are certain ways of behaving as a man that make more sense. One of the things I read just before I left Canada this time, there was a report on a young guy who had jumped off a bridge in Toronto, and he died jumping off the bridge into the river there. And the media represented this as a story of tragedy and beauty. And I read the rest of the article to try and think, well, where's the beauty in this? The tragedy I could understand because the guy had died. Where's the beauty? And the journalist had set up the beauty almost by saying that it's a shame that this man died just doing what normal men do. That it was almost acceptable behavior for that man, that young guy, to take that risk because that was an acceptable way of showing that he was a real man. We also have the problem and this is in the research as well, that women's risk-taking is under-researched and often underestimated. And I find this in male-dominated industries in particular. Because one of the things, when we assume that women are acting more safely because they're softer, they're quieter, they're better at communication, all these assumptions that we make about women, we don't factor in that those women are actually working and surviving and living and doing their gender in masculinized context. So when I go onto a mine site and I see women acting out like men in masculinized way, I'm not surprised at all, because that is the context in which they are expected to work and live and survive. So I have an example once of working with a girl, a young girl. She'd just finished her apprenticeship, and she was put into a team of highly aggressive men. The manager, the mine manager, had made this decision based on his assumption of what women are like, presumably based on his own experience maybe, but he didn't understand gender as an organizational issue or as a relational issue. He just assumed that all women were soft and tame and quiet, and that he could throw her in there and she would tame that team down. That suddenly all the problems they were experiencing, which were safety problems, aggression problems, bullying problems, would suddenly disappear because she would be the mother of that group. It didn't work out, and it almost ruined her career. She was, after 6 weeks of being in that group, she was highly aggressive. She was participating in bullying. She was using her body in very different ways to act out as a very masculine kind of girl in that space, because that's how she learned very quickly to survive. That's how she learned that was the good gender in that space. We often see as well in the research, and this has appeared not only in our own research in mining, but also in the defence forces, in the police, in firefighting, that masculine workplaces often encourage the hero. Now, how is that hero defined? Is the hero defined from a safety system kind of view or a safety policy point of view as the person who stops and talks and thinks about it and identifies risks and responds to those risks accordingly? And or is that hero in the group the kind of person who just goes ahead with it anyway? And they go ahead with the work and then they survive. So it depends, that those two conflicting ideas of what the hero is in a workplace and what it means for a man to be a hero can often conflict with each other. We found that safety messages often speak to a particular kind of gender. So for example, one of the common safety messages that we find in mining is that you stay safe at work to go home to your family. And when and it makes sense. You think, yes, okay, well, that's good, isn't it? Because we want our men to stay safe and they can go home and look after their families. But what we found in one particular work site by doing interviews with men, and this was a remote work site in Western Australia, was that a lot of the men didn't want to go home to their families. For whatever reasons, for a variety of reasons. They were having family issues. They didn't like what they phrased as the nagging. They liked being around in all male environments. They found it very pleasurable. They really enjoyed their work life. That was their understanding of what it meant to be a man. Perfectly valid understanding. Yet they were being faced with a safety message from the safety department and within the organisation saying, stay safe and you can go home safely. Again, there's a conflict there. One of the things that we also find and this can be at the organisational level or also at a smaller crew level, is cultures, small cultures and large cultures set up good gender versus bad gender. Now, when I do my work, I'm not interested in good versus bad. I do not go in with a particular model of what it means to be a man or a woman and say this is what you need to become for everything to work out right. One, I don't have the right to do that. Two, it would never work. And three, people would just look at me and laugh in the context where I work. I don't have knowledge of what is good gender. What I'm interested in is multiple practices of gender. I have had my manager ask me to develop a policy around good masculinity and how the men should be behaving. I've been introduced to a group of 100-odd miners, 2 women in the audience, mostly men, and introduced by the manager as the person who's going to teach you how to be better men. And they went crazy at me from the start. There was no chance that I was going to be able to go ahead with my presentation and training that day. I don't have that model. But cultures tend to set up a preferred way of doing gender. So let's think about this in the extremes for a moment. If we think of gender as practices, so we've broken down now that barrier that there's just man and woman and there's 2 kinds of gender. If we think of practices and a whole spectrum, on the one extreme, we've got hyperfemininity or ultra-femininity, which might be the Kardashians or the Barbies. On the other hand, on the other extreme, we've got the Terminators and the Rambos. the hyper-masculine. Most of us will be somewhere along that spectrum at different times in our lives and in different contexts. So we may choose to be in the middle a little bit more at home and then more masculine at work or less masculine at work. If you've got a work team or an organization that sets up its good masculinity right to the extreme of hypermasculinity, and I've seen these work teams, I've seen these organizations, and that gets set up through habits, practices, through encouragement, through disciplining and punishment of anybody who doesn't perform that way. If that's the kind of team that I'm working in and I'm introduced into that team, in order to be seen as a good man, I need to behave that way. Because if I don't behave that way, the only alternative is to throw me out to the other side and say, you're not a real man, therefore you must be a girl. You must be less man than we are, therefore you're not a proper man. So we've got that kind of team. And then we introduce safety. And safety comes along, and I'm really simplifying it here because I understand the way safety is dealt with is very complicated, but safety comes along and says, right, to this crew of men and women who can act out in that way, I need you to wear some protective equipment now, more protective equipment. We're going to add some more protective equipment. It's not just your boots, it's now particular colours that you've got to dress in, and you've got to wear your hat and a particular kind of hat. And I want you to think every time you do something. Think before you do it. So stop, communicate, talk a little bit. And I want you to follow rules and procedures and policies. And I want you to obey those rules and procedures and policies. I want to protect you. I want to look after you. I want to make sure that you are safe. That kind of approach can be read by those people who understand their gender in a completely different way as feminizing them. It is something that is denying me my right to be a man. And these are the kinds of comments that I hear. It is something that's saying that you want to feminize the organization, that you want to strip me of my masculinity, strip me of my natural gender. So there's safety on the one hand being read as, whether it's real or perceived, being read as very soft, nurturing and caring and mothering. And then my understanding of gender on the other hand, which is I'm in control, I'm independent, I'm strong, I'm tough, and I can do this job. Those two often clash. But we haven't had that debate. We haven't been having that debate in heavy industries where the risk of acting out in particular ways is heightened because of the kind of culture in which those people are working, because of the machinery that they're using, because of the kinds of jobs that they engage in, because of the kinds of risks that are part and parcel of the life of that culture. We've just assumed that we can sort of plonk a bit of a safety story on top and that it'll work out. Now, the other response that I often hear is that those are the bad men because they're not behaving how the safety system or the safety culture wants them to behave. And this is where I talk about, where I emphasize, again, I'm not interested in bad men. I don't see their practices of masculinity as bad or good. I see them as perfectly valid and understandable within the context of their culture. So it is my role, working in a safety space, to firstly understand that. Understand why is that way of behaving important to you? And then I can start talking about safety within that space. I was talking earlier to the group and talking about an example where I was once asked to spend a couple of days with a team of all men on a particular mine site. And this particular team of men, there were 6 or 7 of them, they were really resistant to having women join their crew. Throughout the rest of the workplace, women had been integrated into a number of teams. But these men were particularly resistant, and they had a number of excuses for why women could not work with them. One of their excuses was a piece of heavy equipment that they had. And it was a sort of a big hose that they used as part of their everyday work. And they said to me, this piece of equipment is so heavy and so, you need to be really strong to carry it, that even some of us men have suffered injuries, like shoulder injuries, as a result of our work. by talking to them about that and making some suggestions, some of which I purposely knew would offend them, so I could get some reaction. But through talking about that, I tried to understand. My role is to understand, what does that signify for you? That piece of equipment, what does it mean for you? It was part of they were using it as part of their way of living as men. I suggested that they get the safety department involved to engineer out the issue, to create a new piece of equipment. I knew that what I was saying was controversial to them, but I wanted to see their reaction. And they were mortified, more so because one of them said, if a woman had said that to us, we would understand, but why are you saying that to us? Here, they saw me as a man threatening their masculinity, challenging their understanding of what it meant to be a man, which in a sense it was. I was trying to get them to understand their practices of masculinity and how they affected their attitudes and behaviours towards safety. When we're working at, I've given you sort of, a broad overview of the thinking that we have around gender and safety that has emerged over the last 6 years. When we're in the workplace responding to this, there's a number of tactics that we can take, and a number that we have taken, sometimes in conjunction over different periods of time. But the first stream is education. Part of what I'm doing is talking about the issue and having conversations, and we can take that sometimes to a leadership level, and we've done online courses where safety professionals have been taught about gender and the link between gender and safety. So they start to understand what we're talking about and why it's important. It's also, for those that often think, issues of gender and culture, that's a soft part of workplace. Certainly in my experience, it's not that soft, but we're also take an analytical approach. So it's become possible for us to look at a safety management system, for example, and the systems of an organisation, and to audit those from a gender perspective and say, well, how does this safety management system work in terms of promoting particular gendered behaviours, and are those the gendered behaviours that are most likely to keep people safe in the workplace? And from a practice point of view, one of the people that we work, or groups of people that we work very closely with, is the second group down there, the safety professionals. Getting them to integrate gender, understanding of gender as practice and as doing and as habits, integrate that into their work so that when they're out doing a safety observation in the workplace, they can also be thinking and asking questions that are relevant to understandings of gender, to see if there is any relationship between a safety incident, for example, and people's understandings of gender. In construction right now, so there is some work that's been done in this area, and it's been very slowly for the past year or so. What we know from the external and the local research, by local, so I'm meaning on-site research, is that masculinity also plays an important part in the construction industry, in very similar ways to the mining and oil and gas industry. And this is when I first started exploring this issue in mining industry, often mining professionals would say, it's not us miners, it's the construction people. They're the ones that are doing, they're the problem ones. And so there was a flag there already. I mean, the mining industry is not free of its issues, as those people claim to be. But there was a flag there already that there may be similar issues, and that's certainly what we found. This is, again, it gets played out by this sense of what it means for me to be a man, and in order for me to know what it means to be a man in the workplace, I have to identify somebody who's not man enough, or some things, some activities, some practices that are not man enough, so that I don't do those. And safety can become one of those practices. There's evidence that there's increased that this notion of masculinity links to increased risk-taking by construction workers. Now, again, I need to emphasise for my work, this does not mean that those people who have a particular understanding of masculinity and that it's impacting on their risk-taking behaviour are bad people. They are not bad people. They are taking a perfectly normal and understandable concept of what it means to be a man, and they are living that in the workplace. My role is, what I'm doing is trying to get a conversation going so we can work out, well, how do we respond to this? similar to the mining industry, we're finding that health and safety practices among safety professionals in construction industries are not factoring in gender issues, that gender too is ghettoized and isolated in construction industry. That's talking about purely numbers of women and opportunities for women. What I feel needs to happen, and so I think there's evidence that this will happen soon, but if anybody's interested in this kind of thing, please talk to me. But there's a need for a multi-site analysis in exactly the same way that we did in the mining industry and have started to do in oil and gas, to look at what is the extent of that relationship between gender and safety on work sites, and how is it being addressed, and how could it be addressed. I believe that we already have the foundations there in the research and work and programs that we've developed for mining organizations. And so we don't have to start from scratch, but there is a need to analyze it or to look at it specifically in the industry. And then what does this mean for Christchurch? And I was trying to think a little bit more broadly around gender and safety. Like I said, I don't know the context of Christchurch. I can't even begin to imagine people's experiences over the last few years and ongoing in terms of the work that's required to rebuild Christchurch. Some of the things I was thinking about, just my knowledge of heavy industries and my knowledge of gender culture from more than 20 years of working in this space, is that when there is significant level of fear for personal safety or fear for something happening, now whether that's real or imagined, fear of some harm coming to the self, people are less likely to engage in transformative practices of gender. Now, by transformative practices of gender, I don't mean something we've all got to start dressing up in drag and going out into the street. I'm not talking that transformative. I'm saying anything outside of the norm. So if you have a particular crew that is, and their understanding and practices of masculinity are more the traditional, strong, independent kind of masculinity, if there's a sense of a fear of not being safe outside of that, they're less likely to try gender practices outside, and that can create a very homogenous culture. The research around risk environments and disaster environments suggests that gender affects levels of risk perception. This was raised in a meeting early this morning. We didn't get a chance to discuss it in detail, but that idea of how I understand my gender also impacts on how much risk I identify, whether, again, real or perceived, and how much risk I'm willing to respond to. The research, again, around disaster contexts shows that women are more vulnerable and experience more violence in disaster contexts. And this is as a result of a wide range of disasters. There has been a research paper published last year, on women and gender issues in Christchurch during and after the earthquake. And it argues that women's work is often ignored in the reconstruction phase. One of the things that I find I've played around with this a little bit with some mine managers when they've been talking about expansions or building new mine sites. There is a lot of work out there that looks at the impact of space on gender practices and how space can actually can create safety for men and or women. And so I wonder, I'm thinking at a construction level, yes, there's the construction safety, so the safety of workers at the moment, and whether the relationship between gender and safety that could have an impact there, but also the future Christchurch. What is that Christchurch going to look like as a bigger picture in terms of its layout, in terms of the use of space? And is there already a debate going on about making sure that we can, as much as possible, create a new space, a new Christchurch that is safe for both men and for women, and for all practices of gender? There's certainly my scan of the research around gender, earthquakes, gender, Christchurch, rebuild, disaster recovery. There's certainly a sense what I get a sense is that, my discussions as well with people today and before, is that Christchurch is obviously in a very particular point in its culture and in its history, and it has the potential to be very powerful and very transformative. And so again, one of the things that I was wondering is that there's potentially room for to look at Christchurch as a particular case study for safety and gender, not just in the construction phase, but also in the post-construction phase. And is there anything from the experience here that others can learn from? So to summarize, we have gender, which we've taken outside of men and women. We have gender as practices. My understanding of what it means to be gendered, or what it means to be a particular gender, man or woman, in a particular context will affect the kind of risks that I take. So the question is, to what extent are our understandings of gender in the construction industry, in your workplaces, impacting on people's risk-taking behaviour, firstly? And once we know that, then what is it we can do about it? How is it we respond in a way that doesn't create bad men and bad women, but enables that conversation to strengthen between safety and gender, so that we have a better understanding of what it means to be gendered, alongside what it means to a better understanding of what it means to live safely and work safely. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. That was pretty interesting, actually. We're going to take some questions. So, is anyone would like to ask a question? While you're thinking of that, I've got a question, Dean. For some time we've been aware that by introducing women into the construction industry, we're softening the whole environment and making people a lot less macho and a lot more aware of safety, and we've seen some pretty good results as that. But I've observed that safety protection equipment has almost become blokey in its own right, and that maybe it might be that we make safety a masculine thing rather than a feminine thing. And I'm wondering if any research or you've got any thoughts around that.
When you mentioned the clothing, I remember a comment from somebody who leads up the Women in Mining organisation, I think at the international level, the International Women in Mining organisation. And she was quoted in the media. Now, the media often misquote, so we have to sort of give a bit of understanding here. But she was quoted as saying that there have been significant changes in the gender culture of mining because women can now wear pink boots. My response to that is, and this is, it comes from my understanding of the workings of gender, but also working alongside many women in heavy industries. They don't want pink boots necessarily. Maybe some do, maybe some men do, I don't know. But that's not the issue. What they want is to be able to do their work comfortably and to be treated exactly the same as men. So I don't think, so the issue, I know I've talked about sort of the one extreme masculine and the one extreme feminine. The way that I really view gender is it's not so linear. We don't need to masculinize safety for it to make it work. Equally, we don't need to feminize men to make them safe. We just need to have a better conversation or better responses to what it means to be a man or a woman in your workplace. Let's start with that. In your team. What are the kinds of things that you can do that people will say, yes, that's a good man, that's a good woman? Equally, what are the things that you do or say and people will put you outside of that box and say, don't be such a girl, to the man, for example? Have an understanding of that and understand how gender impacts our lives, and then put that alongside the work that we're already doing in safety to say, well, okay, this is another element. This is another element of our culture, of our psychology, of our behaviours, of our systems, of our structures that we need to factor in in order to continue on that journey of learning about safety and talking about safety and finding different ways of working safely.
Yeah.
I'm Sandy Chamberlain. I'm a tutor at CPIT in the trades department, one of 3 women who have about 70 men to work alongside. We had a conversation in our... I've got so many questions and so much I would like to say, but I will stick to one thing. We had a conversation in our team the other day about trying to place our female apprentice or pre-trade students into work experience or even into jobs, and we have quite a few employers who don't want to have a bar of any females in their workspace, and it's because they don't want... There's a whole load of raft of excuses, and some just say, oh, haven't got any young boys, have you, or whatever. Yeah. Now, my immediate reaction is, I don't want to send our young boys to those employers, as a mother as well, because I don't think they'll be safe. And that's my gut reaction. I said that to the team, and they just had these blank looks and kind of, what do you... Well, we'll just send the girls to the ones who want to be, to the employers who want them, and we'll see the boys to the ones who don't want girls. And I think that's just not the solution. Yeah. So I just put that out there. What is the solution? You're right. It's not the solution. But it's, the option of sending the girls into those environments where they're not wanted, or for whatever reason, is like that example of the mine manager put the girl in the team of highly aggressive men. It's potentially unethical and dangerous. And certainly the interviews that I did with that girl after her experience, she was devastated, and she was psychologically just destroyed, and she did fear for her sexual safety working there every day. So it's potentially unethical. So a solution might be a short-term solution to get those girls into the workplace. Well, okay, we'll find workplaces that are willing to accommodate them and can accommodate them. But you're absolutely right. That's not the industry's responsibility to then to say or ask the question, why is this an issue? Why is it that we have or allow or encourage or don't even know exist? But why is it there are certain pockets, certain teams, certain companies where it's almost deemed acceptable for people to be treated in very unsafe ways in terms of their well-being as they enter the industry? And I don't believe... certainly I've worked with some of the most aggressive and intimidating people, in small teams, and as a sort of a standby researcher / somebody who's trying to do a bit of shadow work beside them, I'm incredibly scared at times. But my role is to help them. I'm sort of trained in this, so it's not as unethical. I make the choice to go in there and do this. But it's to help them think about their practices and behaviours from a gendered perspective. And I'm pretty sure that, I can't think of an example where we failed to get the men to think, there are some things that we actually don't like doing to each other, or there's some kinds of behaviours that we don't like. And what should we do about that, guys? You can get them to at least that point of conversation. So it's a structural thing. It's an industry issue. And that needs to be addressed, and that's certainly the kind of work that I try to do more of. But for those, for the here and now, what choice do you have? But you're absolutely right. I've also worked with young boys and fathers of young boys who are devastated by the changes that are happening to themselves or to their sons as a result of working in certain environments. This shouldn't happen anywhere. So.
Thanks, Dean. You talked about that transformative gender and the fear. And so I was just wondering if you could expand on that in a construction context, like if you've got a team of guys that are working on site and they're at the farther end of that masculinity behaviour, and you're talking to them about scaffolding and how important it's, don't alter the scaffolding, can only be a ticketed scaffolder that does it, and trying to, I guess I just wanted to understand this fear thing a bit more, as if you're trying to instill fear in them, like this is what could happen, you could fall down, break your neck, hurt your colleagues.
Yeah.
Is that the way to go about it, or if those guys are on that range of masculinity, maybe that's instilling fear in them, like you said, maybe that's not a good idea, or could you just expand on that
Sure,
point?
I'll try and use that example. I mean, the idea of the idea of instilling fear in them by saying that if you don't use the scaffolding in a particular way, you could fall down and break a limb or potentially die, is certainly an approach that's taken. My argument is, from understanding practices of gender as well, is sometimes that will work, sometimes it won't. If you're dealing with groups of people, and I say groups because it can include women as well, where their understanding of gender is so much about independence and control and working by themselves and knowing things, and that is a perfectly, on a cultural level, particularly in Australian culture, I know that is a perfectly normal way of understanding gender. They don't, it's not necessarily consciously, but there's a risk sort of analysis that goes on. Do I behave as a different kind of man and risk losing my position as a good man in this group? So do I, for example, say, I'm not going up that scaffolding until X is in place? And do I there risk my masculinity being taken away from me by the potential comments that might be made by my teammates and the way I might feel about myself? Or do I risk doing the job knowing that it might physically harm me? Research that's been done into young male drivers, and this research is based in the ACT and has been replicated, shows that young guys, and I'm pleased by this, I don't mean that young guys are the only ones that take risks, I'm talking about the research. Young guys are far more likely to disobey road rules, which fundamentally are there often to keep us safe in terms of speed and so on. They will disobey those road rules if they believe that there is a risk that by obeying those rules, they will be labelled as a girl or a wuss or less masculine. So if they've got a male friend in the car with them, that male friend doesn't have to say a thing, but their perception, through the research and the interviews have found this, their perception is, I would rather risk my life than risk losing my masculinity. And this is the huge divide that we're talking about. Different levels for different teams and different workplaces, but this is the issue that we're talking about. And I say I include women in that group as well, because I've seen women who will act the same way, understandably, because the team culture or the workplace culture has promoted and encourages a particular kind of gender that is about being tough, being strong, and so on. So I think it's that, and on a psychological level, and I'm not a psychologist, by the way, but on a psychological level, there's that internal sort of debate going on, and to see research, and certainly in some of the safety safety investigations that I've been involved in as the gender sort of eye, that kind of response comes out where guys will, and I say guys because it's men that I've done those investigations on, will talk about the fear of their crew members thinking that they were a wuss if they did something that they knew was part of safety practice and safety policy and knew was more likely to keep them safe than if they didn't do it. But they have that internal debate, and the pull of gender norms is incredibly powerful.
Okay. Thank you. We're run out of time, but please, that was fascinating. Thank you very much.